If you did not receive something from me in your email this week, one of three things happened. You didn't check your email, or the email got lost in cyberspace somewhere, or I don't have your email address. Pardon me? Okay. Okay. So I did send out a paper which you can, it's going to be good for a couple weeks in our lessons. It covers what Matthew, Mark, and Luke said about the particular topic today, and then there on the back page there are two URLs, one of them for a video and another one for some information that was written by Flavius Josephus concerning the destruction of the tabernacle in the year AD 70. So I'm kind of conflicted about these next few messages because they're prophetic messages. In fact, they're really the only prophetic message that Jesus ever gave about what would happen after his death. And it's a lot of history, and it's a lot of stuff that we're not familiar with in the 21st century. So listen carefully and glean what you can, and if you don't understand something, raise your hand and I'll try to make it more clear. Or if you just want to ignore it, just let it go and we'll be fine. Let me read the passage to you. It's from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21. I should be ready to do this, but I'm not. Right where the bookmark is, imagine that. 21 verse 5, and while some were talking about the temple, it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, as for these things which you are looking at, the days will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another, which will not be torn down. And they questioned him, saying, Teacher, when therefore will these things happen? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? So here we go. Slideshow from the beginning. All right. Now today's message is completely from the New American Standard Bible. Usually I use the New Revised Standard Version, but today I'm using the New American Standard Version. Please click subscribe. If you like the video, please do that. Please comment. And please post the video on your social media so others can see it. So I've called this O Jerusalem. And this is the major example of predictive prophecy in the ministry of Jesus. Pardon me? That's last week's slide. Has it got the right date on it? If it doesn't, I will give you a new one. Does it have the right date? I'm sorry, everybody. All right. You got it? All right. Now we're going to talk about prophecy. We're talking about, for the first time really in the ministry of Jesus, he starts speaking about the things that are going to come after him and what they're going to be. He becomes more like an Old Testament prophet at this point. And the main rule of interpretation, and I'm pretty strict on this, no interpretation of Scripture derived from any book in the Bible can legitimately contradict what Jesus clearly taught. Would you agree with that? That's why when you get your Bible and it's got the red letter edition, So the foundation of everything we talk about when we come to what the future will be and what prophecy is teaching in the New Testament has to rest on the foundation of what Jesus clearly taught in ordinary language. There are lots of different types of literature in the Bible. There are myth, in the sense that a myth is the definition of a myth is the origin of something. So we have that type. We have talking donkeys. Those are fables. It's a different type of literature. We have an epic, the story of Job, which tells a whole story of a person's life. We have different types of poetry in the Psalms, where the trees clap their hands. The trees don't actually clap their hands. It's the creation worshiping God is being described by the trees clapping their hands. There are prophetic things which are written in plain language. There are prophetic things that are written in not plain language, in symbolic language. We have whole books of the Bible like that, Revelation being one, book of Zechariah being another. And so there are different types of genre of literature, and some of these different types of literature tell about future things, but whatever they say cannot contradict what's said in plain language. Would you agree? If Jesus is saying it in plain language, that's the basis of the things that we're talking about. And so it says in Corinthians, even the Apostle Paul says, no one can lay any foundation other than the one that has been laid. The foundation is Jesus Christ. So let's look back a little bit from the book of John. The Jews said to him, what sign do you show as your authority for doing these things? They obviously didn't like the things Jesus was doing. They didn't like the things that Jesus was saying. And so they said, by what authority do you do these things? You haven't been to Bible school. You haven't been to seminary. You haven't been trained by us. You don't have a credential paper. You're not affiliated with any of us. Who gave you the authority to do this stuff? And Jesus gives a wise guy answer. Destroy this temple, in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews said, it took 46 years to build this temple. Will you raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking about his body. So we're going to talk about the temple today and what Jesus said about the coming days about the temple. And intermixed with that, there are a couple of other questions, and I want to show you that there's at least 3 different questions that the apostles asked Jesus, which he gave answers to in these particular verses that we're going to look at. Here's the heart of Jesus. We talked about this many weeks ago in Luke chapter 13. By the way, I think we're in sermon number 85 in Luke this week. We've gone almost 2 years, verse by verse. Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together just like a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would not have it. Now, I don't know, how much you know about the Old Testament, but most of the Old Testament, when I say most, more than 50% of the Old Testament revolves around one thing, and that is when the Babylonians came down and destroyed the Jewish temple. The prophets Isaiah, the prophet Ezekiel, the prophet Jeremiah, the prophet Joel, and some of these other prophets, they all came and they said, if you guys don't straighten up, God is going to remove his protection from you, and it's going to be a problem. And they didn't listen, and they didn't listen, and they didn't listen. And eventually Nebuchadnezzar came down from Babylon and destroyed the temple in 586 BC. So most of the Old Testament is around this destruction of the temple. It's still in the memory of the people because they were carried off into Babylon. The temple didn't exist for 70 years, and they were there. They started their synagogue system. They worshiped God in other ways other than temple worship. And then after the 70 years, some prophets raised up, and the king of Iran gave them the ability to go back. Cyrus is the hero of this story. He was an Iranian king, and he let them come back and rebuild the temple. And Zerubbabel and some of the other people came back, and Ezra, and they rebuilt the city and rebuilt the temple. And the point is that the prophets kept saying, you've got to straighten up. You know, there's two types of thought within Judaism at this time. There's the wonderful thought, oh, we have kings and we have prosperity and we're building this and we're building that and everything is good. And on the other hand, the prophets are saying, yeah, but you're exploiting the poor and you're stealing from people. And, you know, it's like Christianity. There's the conservative Christianity where everything should be wonderful and we're the head and not the tail type of stuff. And then there's the other kind of Christianity which says, social justice. And that's the way it was. And read the prophets, which most of us don't read because we don't like what it says, and we don't understand what it says. But basically, what the prophets are saying is, you better straighten up. So the kings are saying everything's wonderful, the prophets are saying everything is not wonderful, and if you don't straighten up, the kingdom is going to be lost. And they didn't listen, and they stoned the prophets. And there was one guy, Jeremiah, 2 books by him, Jeremiah and Book of Lamentations. Jeremiah said, when Babylon comes, submit to them, and they're going to take you away, and they're going to take all of the gold out of the temple and stuff, but just submit to them, and because God is punishing you, and he will bring you back, he will restore you after some time. But the other people, the kings and the people who wanted eternal prosperity based on what God promised to Moses and Joshua, we will never submit to them. And they came and they destroyed everything. So this is history within their understanding. They've been taught these things in school in the time of Jesus. And so God says, I wanted to gather you. I wanted you to be under my wings. This, by the way, shows the female nature of God. It's a hen. God is referred to as a hen. But you wouldn't do it. This is the heart of Jesus. I wanted to, but you wouldn't. You see, there's something about free will here. Therefore, your house is left to you desolate. I say, you will not see me until the time comes when you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. A desolate house, a missing Jesus, who's missing until you recognize who he is. It's all there. Matthew says it this way. Your house is being left you desolate. I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Well, what is the house? The house is the temple of God. And Jesus is coming out of the temple of God, and the disciples are saying, oh man, look at that stone, that's beautiful, and look at this artwork, and look at this stained glass, and look at all this, this is really the nicest place we've ever seen. And Jesus said, it's going to be gone. I heard something. I guess I'm all right. So let's just briefly talk about the temples in the Bible, because, when it says the temple, there are actually 4 temples over different time periods. You can't stay in the same place for 14 generations. I mean, the places fall down. So they started out with this tabernacle, which was an outside thing, and there was a curtain around the whole thing, and the children of Israel camped when they were wandering in the wilderness. 3 tribes camped on the east, 3 tribes camped on the west, 3 tribes camped on the north, and 3 tribes camped on the south. And in the middle was the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy of Holies and the lampstand and incense burner and the place to wash and all of these kind of things. This is the way it started. So after some time, a long time, the time of David and his son Solomon decides to build a temple David provides for the temple. They put it on this hill in Jerusalem, and they inlay it with gold inside and out, and they have a washstand. It shows a little washstand down here in the corner. It's standing on 12 full-size bronze oxen. That's how big it is. And, all the whole inside is gold, and it's Solomon's temple. This is the one that was destroyed by Babylon, which I told you a few minutes ago. After they went to Babylon for their period of time, their 70 years, Zerubbabel came back and he built another temple in its place. And this one was a poor example of the old one, because it wasn't inlaid with gold, and all the furniture and everything was missing. And the scriptures say that the old men, because they had to be in their 90s, or at least late 80s, the old men, when they saw the new temple, cried because it was not the same. And the new people rejoiced. So they rebuilt it. It wasn't as grand anymore. And so after some time, Herod comes to power in Israel, and he takes the original Zerubbabel's temple, and he builds this huge wall around it and expands it, and that's the 40-some years of construction when Jesus said, tear the temple down, and after 3 days I'll raise it up. That's the one he's talking about. And this gives kind of a comparison of Solomon's temple compared to Herod's temple, the one that we're talking about today. So that's just background information. Are there any comments on that or questions? Yes. Yeah, Herod's temple. The question is, which one is the Wailing Wall? And that's the interesting thing, because Jesus said not one stone left upon another, but there are still stones there on that Wailing Wall, which is in the foundation. Good question. Anyone else? Okay, so let's ask ourselves about the purpose of the temple. Why was the temple built? Why was the tabernacle built? It was built, first of all, to be a place where the children of Israel could gather and be around God, because they camped on each side initially. And it was a place where they could come, they could meet a priest who could take a sacrifice and bring it to God and make atonement, which is, in English, it means at one-ment. So somebody goes out and they steal something, and then they feel guilty, and so they go and they pay what they stole back, and they bring their offering to the temple. The priest receives the offering, they slay the offering, the blood is brought into the temple and presented before God. The sacrificial nature of the offering, somebody has to pay for that crime. And so the blood is put in, and God forgives the person who did the wrongdoing, and they become atoned. They become one with God. That's the purpose of the temple. That's the purpose of the priesthood. That's the whole object lesson that the children of Israel were supposed to learn, that somebody needs to pay the price for the things that they do wrong. And God is willing to forgive. He has always been willing to forgive, and when people were faithful in bringing the sacrifice, God would indeed forgive them. So as Jesus is in this temple, it's supposed to be a place of prayer for all nations. And you will recall that a day or two before this, he went in and tipped over the money changers, said, "You've made it a den of thieves." It's supposed to be a place of prayer for all nations. And so he's making himself odious in the temple, because he's coming against the things that are wrong in the temple. They have misinterpreted their religion to the point where Jesus had to come in and correct them, and it was not an easy thing to do. So, all that to say, I see I have 8 minutes left to get to the actual passage that we're talking about today. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to the point to point out the temple buildings. Mark says it this way. As he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said, notice there's an asterisk there, And that means that you'll find this throughout Mark, and if you have a version that points this out, Mark is always in the present tense. So it's not that he said to Jesus, he says to Jesus. Everything is like in the present, and everything moves very quickly in Mark. Behold what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. Luke says, while some were talking about the temple, it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts. So we see that he's on his way out. He has just watched the woman put the 2 mites in the treasury, and he talked about that, which we talked about last week. And so he answers them in Matthew 24, verse 2. Do you not see these things? Truly I say, not one stone will be left upon another which will not be torn down. Mark says it a little more succinctly. Jesus said to him, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another which will not be torn down. And Luke puts it this way, as for these things which you are looking at, the days will come which there will not be one stone upon the other, which will not be torn down. So they had some questions. They have heard Jesus for weeks say, I'm going to Jerusalem, and they're going to kill me and crucify me. And the disciples keep saying no. And they've come up all the stairs to Jerusalem. They've sung all the songs. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And he comes into the temple and he throws over the money changers, and he says this to the Sadducees. He says that to the Pharisees. And he's getting in an argument with everybody. And as they're going out that day, he says, you see this temple? It's finished. It's done. You know, there comes a point where it's not needed anymore. Because there's going to be a sacrifice made in Jerusalem, which is not a sacrifice of bulls and goats. There's going to be a sacrifice in Jerusalem where the blood of Jesus is going to be sacrificed. So there's no need any longer for a temple, because Jesus is coming in and he's providing everything. In the mount of the Lord it will be provided. He's providing his life, he's providing his teaching, and all of these things that we can look to and say yes, or we can look to and say no. And those people, many of the Pharisees, many of the Sadducees, not all, rejected what Jesus had to offer, which was his blood, which was his life. Blood and life. Blood is a metaphor for life. And so he looks at the disciples and he said, this temple is finished. And they went to the Mount of Olives, it tells us in the book of Mark. Here's a picture of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. And it's really hard to see. You know, this isn't really bright enough, but here's the wall of Jerusalem. It's that high, and this is I think it's the Kidron Valley. And so Jesus would go out and he would camp out, sleep outside on the Mount of Olives whenever he came to Jerusalem. And he's looking across, and the Mosque of Omar was not there. Obviously, the Temple of Herod was there at the time. Did you know that the Muslims tore down all the churches in the East? They either tore them down, or they put minarets on the top of them and turned them into mosques. And that's what they did here in Jerusalem. We'll fix them. We'll fix those Jews. We'll build our mosque right on top of where the temple was. Let's see if they can worship there again now. You should fear these people, because if you read history, you can see that's what they have done throughout history. You should not trust them. They have a different agenda. And so he's on the Mount of Olives, and he's looking across with the disciples. And it's not all the disciples. The scripture tells us it's just certain of the disciples. Mark 13. He was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. Peter and James and John and Andrew were questioning him privately. Who's not there? Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not there. They have heard this. This has come down through the word of mouth. In fact, the rest of the disciples are not there either. Matthew doesn't even mention who was there. In Matthew, they come, when will these things happen? What things? When will the temple be torn down? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So there's questions there, maybe 3. In Mark, he's sitting on the Mount of Olives. Peter, James, and John and Andrew are there. We know that John lived a long time. He lived at least until the year 90 and was the author of the book of Revelation. Mark mentions that Peter is there and James is there. James was the first person that was killed, first martyr. You can find his death in the book of Acts. And so really the only one who could have really passed this on was John. And we see here that they say Mark was the understudy of Peter. He was Peter's disciple. So the book of Mark records the memory as Mark heard it from Peter. He was there, but he was just a young guy. In fact, there's one story in the book of Mark where they came to arrest Jesus, and they tried to grab the young man, and they grabbed him, and he ran away naked. They grabbed his clothes, and the clothes came off as he ran away. And that has always been thought to be Mark's story. He doesn't say, I was there and I lost my clothes, but he mentions that this kid escaped. So they've always thought that was Mark. So the question in Mark is, when will these things be? What will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? And Luke is much more specific, and in the now, he says, what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? Now, I think if you look at this and you step back, you have to say, this was not a 3-minute conversation. This was a sit down with 4 of the disciples and a back and forth and many questions about the temple and many questions about what will be the sign just before the temple is destroyed and what will it be like when Jesus returns. So all of these questions are answered, but they're not given in a bullet point document like we like. At least like I like. I'm a left brainer. I want to say boom, 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 boom. That's why I gave you this together. These things moved separately. So what are the signs? The sign of his coming and of the end of the age, according to Matthew. When will these things be? What will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? All these things. What will be the sign when these things are about to take place? So there are different questions asked. There are different answers given. Do you have any question or comment at this point? Okay, I'm out of time. Do you mind if I go a little bit longer? Okay, next slide. Jesus answered, said, "See to it that nobody misleads you. Many will come in my name saying, I'm the Christ, and will be able to mislead people," because it says they will mislead many. It's not they might mislead many, they will mislead many. In Mark, Jesus says, "See to it that no one misleads you." Just as simple. In Luke, "See to it that you're not misled. Many will come and saying, I am he. The time is near. Do not go after them." Now, we've read other things about end times. Other people have written about prophetic things, and you've sat in on classes about Revelation, or the end time teaching in the books of Thessalonians. Do you think the time is near? Well, I'll tell you, it's a lot nearer today than it was when this was written. The scriptures talk about a day that will come when a machine can think and talk. I remember around 1981, some of you weren't even born yet, but there was a magazine in those days called Newsweek. And I was a subscriber to Newsweek, and they put the first PC on the cover of Newsweek as the person of the week. And it said, the PC is here. I predict nothing will ever be the same. And that was the truth. I was really, as soon as I could get into computers, man, I was getting into them. I was way ahead of the curve on that. When we got our first web page here at Cheshire, there were only 18 pages on the internet with the word Canandaigua on it. 18 pages. That was it. That's how early I was in on it, because computers, they're cool. They do a lot of stuff, and now I'm getting a little scared about it. It wants to tell me what to think, and just put in the information you want. If I said to AI, I can say, how should I preach a sermon on the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem? It would print it out for me. I would never do that. Artificial intelligence. What we need is some real intelligence, not artificial intelligence. What will be the sign? Well, I'll tell you what won't be the sign. Somebody coming and saying, I'm Jesus. That will not be the sign. If anybody claims to be me, it's not the sign. I told you one time about the guy I met nearly 50 years ago, and wearing a blanket with a hole cut out for his head, and he told me that he was Jesus. I said, I don't think you're Jesus. Bible says that Jesus will return as lightning comes from the sky from the east to the west. And he said, yeah, that's me. I'm Flash Lightning. The guy told me that right to my face. Fortunately, I had read this stuff. Otherwise, I might have believed him. He looked like Jesus. He had sandals on and everything. He had a beard. So, see to it that no one misleads you. That's up to you. See to it that no one misleads you. That's up to you. That's up to me. The time is near. Don't go after them. Don't follow anybody that comes to you and says that he's Jesus. Period. What's the sign? Well, here's an anti-sign. Next slide. You'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. Don't be frightened. They must take place. These are not the sign. Nation against nation fighting. That's not the sign. Earthquakes. That's not the sign. Famines. That's not the sign. The only one that gets me is the talking machine. There have been nation against nation fights since the beginning of time. There have been kingdom against kingdom fights since the beginning of time. There has been earthquakes time immemorial. I had the blessing of experiencing the huge earthquake in Seattle. I happened to be there that day. Great big earthquake where I ran outside and the ground was moving like ocean waves and the trees were flying back and forth, and it threw the eagle right out of the eagle's nest and it flew away. It was the incredible power of the earthquake. In the Old Testament, there's a place where it says, this happened X number of years after the earthquake. So they actually started marking time from the earthquake. Well, it must have been a couple years after the earthquake. We used to do it. Well, it must have been a year or so after Caleb was born. We were able to find some place to mark time that way. These things are not the sign. And when people say they are the sign, they are contradicting what Jesus said. He said they're not the sign. He says they are the beginning of birth pangs. Well, I never had any birth pangs, but I have noticed some people who have. Sean always tells the story that I had to stop at McDonald's to get a cup of coffee on the way to the hospital when Amos was ready to be born. It's only going to take a minute.
But I had already waited for you to finish your sermon.
That's true.
My legs crossed my water.
She went home and with my Uncle Lee, and I stayed and preached. I'm very proud of that. How far apart are the contractions? 15 minutes? Yeah. Chill out. 10 minutes. Well, and the more kids you have, the faster it seems to happen. When Daisy was born, it was like, hey, I think I better go to the hospital. We got there, and we couldn't find the doctor. And Dr. Page came in because our doctor was missing somewhere, and he's gloving up and everything. And unfortunately, our doctor showed up, and she slipped right out. And there she is right there. God bless her. I'm still there. Verse 8. These things are the beginning of birth pangs. These things are not the sign. These things are periodic troubles that will come before the plagues, the great plagues and stuff will continue to come. So, some applications. I thought of a couple more of these. The old sacrificial system isn't needed anymore. Why does the temple need to be destroyed? Because it just doesn't do it anymore. Because there's a permanent sacrifice. The Son of God who's seated at the right hand of God and told to be a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, according to Psalm 110. Jesus wished these things would not go this way. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. There's something about free will. The church people have always asked when. And the answer has always been, it's not for you to know. To opt, you might not like this one, to opt for a political solution, which is what they did. They had Jesus arrested and said that he was an insurrectionist and he was against Rome. That was exactly what they were looking for in a Messiah. So for somebody to raise up, hey, we're the head, David was king and God is going to restore us to the kingdom like it was before, and everybody better pray. And so we're going to raise up these leaders and we're going to rebel against Rome. To opt for a political solution instead of accepting Christ eventually leads to national suicide. That's the meaning of this story. If you don't accept the real Christ, you will certainly accept a false one because you need a Savior. Which one will you have? And the third is, see that no one would deceive you. The world is inclined to deception, and so are we. So there are a few lessons there that we can look at in the 21st century, and I know I went over 10 minutes, but you might have a question or comment. Yes, Priscilla.
Thanks. It's a nitpicky thing, but it says in Matthew 24:1, they were talking about the temple, and they said, I came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. So maybe that's why the wall is still there. Was it part of the building, or was it just part of the outer? ramparts.
I don't know the answer to that. I've always been intrigued by the fact that that Wailing Wall is still there.
Still there.
And so, I don't know. Maybe that's going to be torn down. I have to plead ignorance. I don't know. Anyone else? Okay. If you did not get this in your email, and you check and you find out that it is actually there, because it was sent to everybody's email who gave me their email here a few weeks ago, send me an email to pastor@cheshirecchurch.com, and I will send an email back to you, and then that should make it so that the stuff doesn't go in your spam. So if you didn't get one, I have a few here in hard copy, and we'll move ahead because there's a whole lot of cool stuff coming up of what Jesus said about the real end times.